Okay, a field in back of me that you see here, okay? We're a little bit about 100 yards south of Mount Washington, which is directly behind me. Now this area that you see here, which has been beautifully restored to what it probably looked like during the Battle of Brandywine. Now there's power poles over my head. Now when these power poles run along an area, the telephone company wants this area cleared out. They clear out this area so they can work on the lines efficiently. They don't want a lot of branches and trees growing in the area. Now that gives us an opportunity in this area to observe what some of the troops saw and some of the troops that were in this area saw and camped. Now this is a plowed field. This would have looked like this. It would have looked just like this. Now Nathaniel Green would have stationed his troops right here in this area. This was the reserves. This was the far left of Washington's line at Brandywine. Now this is a little bit back farther from the Brandywine Creek. The Brandywine Creek is about almost about a mile to the south in that area. Now he had his troops here in two positions. He had them here in the beginning of the battle. He had them here as reserves so he could protect the far left of his line. Now his line extended all the way to Britain's Ford, but he had his troops reserved here in case that the British crossed at Chad's Ford. The troops that were stationed in the field behind me couldn't advance towards the British that were coming over the Brandywine. Now, Nathaniel Green's troops would have been camped here. This would have been a plowed field, which you see today. It's short grass, and the power company did a beautiful job at showing exactly probably what it looked like back in 1777. The trees wouldn't have been here on this line. You would have been able to see all the way to the ridge that extended from Chad's Ford all the way up to probably Gibson's Ford. You would have been able to see that. You would have seen the trees on the other end of the Brandywine because this area looked like Lancaster County today. It was completely plowed. There was nothing here. All the trees that were here were cut to make wood. There was a sawmill near the Brandywine, and also they used them for fuel and they used them for building. So all the trees that you see today are here because they were allowed to let grow probably from the 1940s on. Now this would have been somebody's property most likely. He would have owned about 100 acres of ground here. Now Mr. Gilpin owned about 300 acres, probably here also. His house was Lafayette's headquarters at the Battle of Brandywine. He owned this area. He had people that plowed. He had farmers that worked for him. He probably most likely gave a lot of this land to different people that worked on his property they worked the land and they got paid to work the land. Now in the distance, I could see a hill or a ridge in the distance. That's on the other side of the Brandywine. If you look over a little bit further, I don't know if the camera can see, probably where I'm pointing in that general direction. Now that's where the guns were. That's where the British heavy artillery was. That's where these 12-pound guns were. And they can hit this area no problem. It's not that far to hit this area. So Nathaniel Green's reserves were in this area. Now Nathaniel Green himself was a fighting Quaker. He was a Quaker. Now during this time, Quakers weren't allowed to get involved in battles. They were very peaceful people. They didn't really bother anybody. But Nathaniel Green was different. He was a smart man. He was the second in charge. If Washington was hit on the battlefield or was killed on the battlefield, Nathaniel Green was the second in command. He would have took over the army. Now like I said, his troops were stationed. They probably were stationed up on that ridge up there too, where the Pennsylvanians were. Now I'll try to pan over there if I could see. Up in the distance, there's a plowed field. Now that plowed field is where the Pennsylvanians would have been. Now that was Anthony Wayne's division in the distance. They would have been stationed right up on that hill. Now from what I'm seeing and what I'm noticing in this general area, it's extremely hilly. Now that's good in two ways. It's good and bad in two ways. It's good because you can get intelligence on the other side of the Brandywine, like Washington did. He stationed himself on Mount Washington, and he had a spyglass, and he could see for miles in the distance with the British movements. Now his headquarters is just a little bit, about 200 yards off to my left here, but Anthony Wayne's division is up on that ridge also. Now that ridge at Brandywine went and extended all the way down Creek Road for about 2 miles. All you should do is station your troops there, and you can see the troops, the British amassing on the other end. Now, from where I'm looking, it's just extremely hilly. Now, like I said, the advantages were that you could see. The disadvantages were you can't see sometimes. If you're down in a gully, if you're in the lowlands where the creek is, because if it's a creek, it's low land, what happens is you can't see what's going on the other ridge. Now, there could be other troops amassing on the other end that you cannot see. So it's good and it's bad for hills in this area. Now, these are hills. These aren't mountains. These are hills that you'll be able to run up. They weren't really that steep. You could take, if the British were coming through this area, which they did come through this area, they could run up these hills efficiently. It wasn't like they had to climb, but they had to get through the American forces. All right, about the troops that were stationed here. Now, these troops were called. They were called, they were brought and back from this area where I'm standing, they were brought over to Washington's headquarters. Now, the reason why this was done, because the Pennsylvanians were thinned. They had to send some of the Pennsylvanian troops up to Birmingham Township to counter, it was for Howe's flanking maneuver. Now, Washington definitely knew that there was a flanking maneuver. He let some of the Pennsylvanians go. So what he had to do was he had to take some of his troops from the left of his line. Now, the left of the line was extended out into this area. He had to take these troops and he had to start filling up positions in the center. Now, the center was Chad's Ford. Now, if you left Chad's Ford unprotected, they could just come across and bring all their ammunition in wagons. They didn't want that. They wanted the Chad's Ford protected. So when they knew that the Birmingham Meeting House area was starting to be invaded by Cornwallis and Howe, like I said, some of the Pennsylvanians left. So he had to take some troops and bring them over to across where Washington's headquarters is. He was still in reserve. Now, he took about 3,000 troops. He had about 4,000 troops. He took about half his troops and enforced the Pennsylvania line. Now, generally, this is very, very good because the British couldn't see what was going on here. Now, if you notice, on the other side of the Brandywine, it's pretty far. It's about a mile, maybe about 3/4 of a mile away. Now, he kind of moved troops out of here slowly. Now, that's how you have to do. If you want you want to do an orderly retreat of troops. So if you take all your troops and you take all your troops out of an area, the enemy's going to see that and they're just going to come across the creek and come and get you. What he did was slowly take his troops out, little at a time, and brought them right behind Washington's headquarters and over into Anthony Wayne's line. Now, the British didn't know that this line was starting to thin, but it did thin. But he had 2,000 troops, and they were all stationed in the field behind me. Now, what that did was it showed that Washington's troops were going to Birmingham. He knew that. The British knew that. But they didn't know that the line at Chad's Ford was starting to thin. But it was starting to fill up with troops from, this area right here. Very smart. Washington was a smart man. Now, you see Washington and you hear about Washington and things like that. He was a quiet man, but he was a very intelligent man. He knew exactly what to do in these situations. He knew how to be a good commander. He knew the tactics at the time. Now, this was line-to-line fighting. They stood in a line, they fired. Everybody knows that. But it wasn't really like that. You had to station your troops so that the other army wouldn't come and get you. But in back of me, this is where, the fighting Quakers, as they were called, were stationed. They were stationed in this area behind me. So it's great that they have a spot here on the battlefield, which it is the battlefield, that is plowed, and you can see the sight lines today. Very, very, we're very fortunate to see the sight lines. But this is where, some of the reserves were stationed during the Battle of Brandywine.